You're not family, Brady. You never were. You're a project she felt sorry for, and I think deep down you know that. That's what Portia Dunbar-Vance said to me at the Christmas Eve dinner table in her mother's Muskoka cottage, with 12 people listening and my 14-year-old daughter sitting right beside me. She said it the way people say things they've been rehearsing, calm and measured, like she'd been waiting all evening for the right pause in the conversation. And maybe she had. I didn't shout. I didn't make a scene. I set down my fork very carefully on the edge of my plate, the way my own mother taught me. And I looked at Portia and I said, "Thank you for being honest. I appreciate that." And then I pushed back my chair and I looked at Maya and I said, "Get your coat, sweetheart." We drove back down the highway in the dark. Maya didn't say much. She's 14 and she's wise in that quiet way some kids get when they've had to grow up a little faster than they should. At some point she reached over and put her hand on my arm, and that was enough. We stopped at a Tim Hortons in Gravenhurst and got hot chocolates and sat in a booth for a while without talking, just warming up. The snow coming down soft and steady outside the window. And I want to tell you something about that drive and that Tim Hortons booth, because it matters. Because it was exactly there, sitting across from my kid with the Christmas lights, blinking in the glass, that something became very clear to me that I'd been refusing to look at squarely for the better part of a year. Portia was wrong about one thing. I was not a project. And 3 weeks later, she was going to find out exactly how wrong, when the real estate lawyer handling the sale of that cottage called to tell her that the deal couldn't proceed. That there was a co-owner who had not consented to the sale. That the co-owner's name was on the deed. That the co-owner was me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. None of this means what it needs to mean unless I tell it properly, because the story isn't really about the deed. It's about how I ended up in that cottage in the first place, and what Elspeth Dunbar was actually like, and why a 41-year-old roofer from Barrie, with a pickup truck and a daughter and a mortgage he was barely keeping, Current thought he had any business being at Christmas dinner with one of the wealthiest families in Ontario. So let me back up. My name is Brady Coulter. I run a small roofing and general contracting operation out of Barrie. Just me and 2 guys I've worked with for years. We do solid work on older houses, the kind of detail work that bigger crews don't have patience for. I'm not rich. I clear enough to keep the lights on and put money in Maya's respite every month and save a little besides, which is more than a lot of people manage, and I don't take it for granted. Maya's mom left when Maya was 4. I'm not going to go into the details of that, because it's not the story I'm telling. But I've been doing it alone since then, and I won't pretend that's always been easy. Or that there haven't been nights when I sat in the kitchen after Maya was asleep and wondered how much longer I could keep all the plates spinning. The way I met Elspeth Dunbar was the most ordinary thing in the world. She called my number off a flyer I'd put up at the hardware store in Gravenhurst. That was the spring before last, May. She had a heritage cottage on a lake about 40 minutes north of town. One of those old Muskoka properties, stone foundation, wraparound porch, a boathouse older than most of the houses I work on, and the roof was in serious trouble. She'd had 3 contractors quote the job, and she told me later she'd been about to go with a big outfit from Bracebridge when something made her call me instead. The cottage had been in her late husband's family since 1937. Arthur Dunbar had died 3 years before. Elspeth was 71, still sharp as a tack, but she was spending winters in a condo in Toronto and coming up to the lake in the warmer months, and the property had started showing its age in ways she couldn't keep up with alone. I went up to quote the job on a Tuesday. She met me at the door herself, which I mention because a lot of people with money like Elspeth's don't. She walked me around the whole property, pointed out every problem she'd noticed, asked thoughtful questions about materials and drainage and load-bearing capacity over the boathouse. She knew things. She wasn't performing knowledge. She actually knew the building. Arthur had taught her, she said. The job took most of June. Elspeth was there the whole time. She'd bring coffee out in the mornings, not because she had to, just because she was that kind of person. She'd ask my guys their names and remember them the next day. She didn't hover a second guess. She trusted us to do the work, and when it was done, she stood on the dock and looked up at the new roof and said, Arthur would have liked the way you did the ridgeline. I don't know why that got to me the way it did. Maybe because my own dad died when I was 19, and I still miss him in this low, steady way that doesn't really go away. Maybe because she said it without any performance in it. She just said it simply, the way you say a true thing. I should tell you who Elspeth Dunbar was, because who she was is the whole center of this. Her late husband had built Dunbar Timber into one of the larger forestry operations in northern Ontario, and Elspeth, who'd worked in the business alongside him for 30 years, had managed the wind-down of that operation after his death with a clarity and competence that surprised people who hadn't been paying attention to her. The Dunbar estate was substantial. Elspeth didn't talk about money in any direct way, but she didn't pretend it wasn't there either. What she cared about was the property, the lake, the old growth behind the ridge, and the people around her, a diminishing circle, as she put it, with the specific candor of someone who has reached the age where they can say things plainly. Her daughter Portia was the only child still in regular contact. Elspeth had a son, Dale, who lived in Calgary and called on birthdays and sometimes not even then. Portia lived in Toronto with her husband Alec Vance, who worked in private equity, and Portia's relationship with her mother was the kind that looks close from a distance and feels cold from the inside. She visited 3 or 4 times a year. She had opinions about the property and how it should be managed. She had ideas about what Elspeth should do with it eventually, and those ideas involved selling it, and she returned to them regularly. Elspeth did not want to sell. After the roofing job was done, I kept in touch with Elspeth in a low-key way, texting occasionally, checking in about whether the gutters were holding. When she mentioned in August that the boathouse deck was soft in 3 places, I drove up on a Saturday with Maya and fixed it while Maya swam off the dock. Elspeth sat in one of the old Muskoka chairs and talked to Maya about the lake like they were old friends, and Maya, who is not easily charmed, was visibly charmed. On the way home she said, "She's actually pretty cool for someone that old." High praise. I went back a few times that fall, not always for work. Sometimes Elspeth would call and say the furnace was making a noise, and sometimes she'd call and just want company, and she was direct enough about both that I respected her for it. She told me once that the hardest thing about being old and wealthy was that people found it very difficult to just sit with her. They were always either managing her or performing for her, and she found it exhausting. I didn't perform. I'm not built for it. I'd sit on the porch with her and drink tea and talk about things that mattered and things that didn't. She told me about Arthur and about the early years of the business, when they were scrambling for contracts and living in a trailer beside their first work site. I told her about Maya and the roofing business and my dad, who'd been a mechanic and the most patient man I'd ever known. We were good company for each other. I want to be clear about what that was, because Portia had a story in her head about it, and I don't want you walking away with the same story. I was not angling for anything. I was not calculating. I was just a person who found genuine pleasure in an older woman's company, who respected her, who sometimes showed up to fix things, because I knew she'd have trouble getting anyone reliable to come this far north on short notice, and who sometimes showed up just because she'd asked. That's all it was, and that, it turned out, was enough to matter in ways I hadn't anticipated. Now let me tell you about the October before that Christmas. Because, before I tell you what happened at dinner, I need to tell you about the conversation that changed everything. Elspeth called me on a Thursday evening with something that wasn't a roofing question. She told me she'd been thinking, and she needed to talk to me about the property. She said she wanted to put my name on the deed to the cottage as a joint tenant. She explained her reasoning calmly and at length. Portia had been pressuring her to list the property for sale, and Elspeth did not want to sell. She'd already spoken to her lawyer in Toronto. She understood exactly what she was doing. She said she'd chosen me because she trusted me, because she knew I'd respect the land the way Arthur had, and because she wanted to create a situation where Portia could not legally dispose of the property without her consent or mine. She said, "I know this is an unusual thing to ask, Brady, and I won't be offended if you say no." I sat with that for a few days. I talked to my own lawyer, a woman named Janet Forsyth who works out of Barrie and has handled my affairs since I started the business. Janet looked at the arrangement, asked me a lot of questions, and told me that Elspeth's lawyer had drawn it up properly, and that if I was going into this with open eyes, it was legally sound. I went back to Elspeth. I asked her if Portia knew. She said no, and she intended to keep it that way for now. She said, "What Portia doesn't know she can't argue with. I'll tell her when I'm ready." I said yes. We signed the documents in early November. Janet kept copies. Elspeth's lawyer kept copies. I kept copies in the filing box I use for property documents, which sits under the workbench in my shop. I want to tell you why I didn't feel right about telling people. It wasn't because I was embarrassed, though there was some of that. A roofer from Barrie co-owning a century-old Muskoka estate is not a story that travels without eyebrows raised. It was because it felt like Elspeth's private business, and she'd asked me to let her handle it in her own time, and I respected that. I didn't tell my guys. I didn't tell anyone, really, except Janet. So when Portia looked across the Christmas Eve table and called me a project her mother felt sorry for, she was doing it in complete certainty. She was doing it without a single doubt in her mind that she was right. I was the handyman. She was the daughter. It was obvious to everyone at the table what the power structure was, or so she believed. The dinner had been fine until about halfway through dessert. Elspeth had invited me and Maya because she wanted us there. And she'd said so plainly. And that should have been enough. There were 8 other people around that table. Portia and Alec, 2 of Portia's friends from the city, a neighbor couple from up the road, and Elspeth's oldest friend, a woman named Bernice who drove up from Aurelia every Christmas. The conversation was fine. The food was beautiful. Elspeth had cooked most of it herself, which I could see surprised Portia, who seemed to prefer catered. I noticed Portia watching me the way people do when they've decided you don't belong somewhere. The way they track your movements and wait for you to reach for the wrong glass or say the wrong thing. I'd been aware of it all evening. I wasn't new to being looked at that way. When you spend your working life in other people's nice houses, you get calibrated to it quickly. What I wasn't expecting was for her to say it out loud. She waited until Elspeth had gone to the kitchen to slice more of the Yule log. Then Portia set down her wine glass and set it, conversationally, to the table, the way you'd make an observation about the weather. She said I wasn't family. She said I was a project. She said I was a handyman Elspeth felt sorry for, and that everyone at the table knew it. Alec, to his credit, looked at his plate. The neighbors looked uncomfortable. Portia's city friends looked between her and me with the careful attention of people who'd seen this particular performance before and were waiting to see how it landed. Maya went very still beside me. My first instinct was to say nothing. Then I thought about Maya, and I thought about what she was learning right there about how a person carries themselves when they've been insulted in public, and I thought about what I wanted her to see. I set down my fork. I looked at Portia. I said, "Thank you for being honest. I appreciate that." I said it without sarcasm. I meant it, because she'd shown me something I needed to see clearly, and I was grateful for the clarity, even if the lesson was going to be expensive for her. Then I asked Maya to get her coat. Elspeth came back from the kitchen holding the cake server, and she looked at the 2 of us standing with our coats, and I saw in her face that she understood immediately what had happened. She didn't make a scene. She walked me to the door quietly while Portia watched from the table with the expression of someone who'd expected resistance and wasn't quite sure what to do with its absence. Elspeth squeezed my hand at the door and said, "I'm sorry, Brady." I said, "Don't be. It's fine. Merry Christmas, Elspeth." And she said, "I'll call you." And I said, "I know you will." Maya and I drove in the dark with the radio on low. The snow had started again, the soft kind that comes down without wind and makes the highway quiet. At Gravenhurst, we pulled off for Tim Hortons. We got hot chocolates and sat in the booth by the window, and Maya looked at me and said, "She was wrong, you know." I said, "I know," she said. "You're not a project, you're her friend." And I said, "Yeah." And I meant it, and it still ached a little. I want to tell you what I was actually thinking in that booth, because it took me the longest to be honest about. I'd been telling myself a gentler version of the story for a year, that the class difference didn't matter, that what I had with Elspeth was just 2 people who liked each other's company, and that was simple and clean. And sitting there dripping snow off my jacket, I had to admit it wasn't quite that simple. There was a version of this story, Portia's version, that had a logic to it, A working man who keeps showing up at a wealthy widow's property, makes himself useful, gets invited to Christmas dinner. I could see how that story got told, even if it wasn't the true one. I also had to admit that it had gotten to me more than I was willing to show at that table. Not the insult itself, but the ease in Portia's voice. The way she'd said it conversationally, without even raising her tone. The way Alec had looked at his plate. What bothered me most was the moment, just a moment, where I'd been uncertain about what Maya should see me do. I don't think it's wrong to feel that. I think that's just what it feels like when someone decides you don't exist. But what it also clarified, sitting there, was something about that November document I'd been treating as an abstraction, as a private arrangement, as something that had nothing to do with the world the way it actually worked. It wasn't an abstraction. It was real, and it was documented, and it meant something specific. Portia needed that cottage. She needed the sale she'd been pushing her mother toward for 2 years. I'd learned this from Elspeth, who'd heard it through her own financial advisor. Portia and Alec had overextended badly, a bad set of investments, and a renovation project in the beach neighborhood that had gone catastrophically over budget, and they were quietly underwater in a way their lifestyle didn't reflect. The Muskoka property, at what Portia believed it would sell for in the current market, would solve most of that problem. Without my signature, it couldn't be sold. I am not a man who enjoys other people's trouble. Driving home with Maya asleep against the window, I was not calculating. I was not planning. I was just driving, and the knowledge was just there, steady and quiet under everything, like a foundation you trust because you poured it yourself. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Janet. She'd heard from the lawyer handling the estate, who'd heard from the real estate agent Portia had retained, and the message coming back through all those channels was straightforward. There was a co-ownership interest on the property that no one in Portia's circle had been aware of. The sale could not proceed without the co-owner's consent. Janet asked me what I wanted to do. I told her to tell them I wasn't available for a conversation about the property at this time. I also called Elspeth directly, not to coordinate a strategy, just to tell her what was happening, because she deserved to know first. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been expecting my call. She said, "I imagine this has caused some difficulty on that end." I said, "I imagine it has." She said, "How are you, Brady? How's Maya?" I said we were fine. I said I was sorry if this had made things harder for her on the family side of things. She said something I've thought about a lot since. She said, "Brady, what Portia doesn't understand and may never understand is that kindness has to be chosen every single day, or it isn't kindness, it's just habit. Arthur chose it. You choose it. She stopped choosing it a long time ago, and she doesn't even know she did." Then she said, "Don't sell. I don't want you to sell." And I said I had no intention of selling. The weeks after that were uncomfortable in the specific way that happens when the truth about a situation comes out all at once and lands on people who weren't ready for it. Portia called me once. The conversation was short and not kind, and I said very little except that I intended to act lawfully and in good faith with respect to the property, and that Janet Forsyth was my point of contact for any further discussions. I was calm. Not cold. Calm. There's a difference, and I think Portia heard it, because the call ended quickly. What I heard afterward through Elspeth was that Portia's version of events shifted considerably once the actual facts became known in their circle. In her version, I had manipulated an elderly woman into signing documents against her own interests. In the actual version, which could be verified by anyone who'd spent 10 minutes with Elspeth Dunbar, this was not something that had happened or could happen. Elspeth was 71 and had been managing significant financial decisions for most of her adult life, and she had her own independent lawyer who had reviewed every document. There was no version of the facts in which I'd taken advantage of anyone, and Portia knew that, which is why the version she was telling didn't stick. I never did sell my share of that cottage. We have an arrangement now, Elspeth and I, that is formal and documented and clear, the way all good arrangements should be. I help maintain the property. I bring Maya up in the summers. Elspeth is doing well. She's one of those people who gets sharper with age rather than softer. And she has a lot of years in her still, I think. Portia and I don't speak. That suits both of us. I understand she and Alec have restructured their finances and are managing. I don't feel good about their difficulty, and I don't feel bad about it either. It is simply what happened when someone who needed something they couldn't have was reminded that the world doesn't arrange itself according to what they've decided they deserve. What I feel, mostly, when I think about that Christmas Eve and the weeks after, is something I can only describe as a quiet kind of waking up. For a long time I'd been bracing for it, for someone in that world to finally say out loud what I could see they were thinking. And when Portia finally said it, something fell away. The weight of waiting for it, the effort of pretending it wasn't in the room. Maya is 15 now. She asked me once, in the fall, whether I thought Portia had meant to be mean or whether she'd just done it without thinking. I told her I believed Portia had thought about it carefully, that kind of deliberate dismissal doesn't usually happen by accident. Maya was quiet for a moment and then she said, "That's sadder, in a way." I thought about that for a long time afterward. I decided she was right. Here's what I keep coming back to, and then I'll let you go. Portia sat at that table certain that she understood the full shape of the situation. Certain that she knew exactly who had power and who didn't, who was family and who was the charity case, who had the right to decide who belonged at Christmas dinner. She was so certain she said it out loud, with her mother's oldest friend sitting right there and my kid beside me. She had no idea that the thing she needed most, the sale that was going to fix the mess she'd made of her finances, the property she'd been counting on for 2 years, the asset at the center of her plan. She had no idea that it required my name on a piece of paper before it could go anywhere, and that piece of paper was already signed, already filed, already sitting in a folder in a lawyer's office in Toronto, and another one in a box under my workbench in Barrie. Be careful about who you've decided is beneath you. Be careful about who you cast as the handyman, the project, the one who should be grateful to be tolerated. Because sometimes the person you're dismissing is the one who poured the foundation. Sometimes the ground you've been counting on has someone else's name on it, and the day they stop being patient, not out of anger, just out of clarity, you might find out all at once exactly whose ground you've been standing on. I didn't walk out of that cottage with any plan. I walked out because my daughter was watching, and because I finally understood that no version of belonging I could earn at that table was worth the price of pretending I hadn't heard what I'd heard. That's not wisdom, exactly. It's just what you get to after enough years of doing things right even when no one's watching. A certain steadiness that doesn't need the room to agree with it. I'm a roofer from Barrie. I drive a 2019 F-150 with a scratch on the passenger door I keep meaning to fix. I coach Maya's soccer team in the spring. I burn dinner about twice a week, and I have exactly 2 friends I call in a real emergency. I am not a remarkable person by any of the measures Portia was using that night. But I showed up. I did the work. I came back when I was asked, and when Elspeth needed someone she could trust with something that mattered, I was the person she called. That's all. That's the whole of it. And it turned out to be enough.